My name is Ray.
Hi, this is Michael.
Welcome to another episode of Ray's Economics Clue Book. Today, we're talking about inflation and Seigniorage and how that plays into our inflation tax and government revenue.
Okay.
So look at the classical model price level we talked about earlier. The real quantity of money and demand supplied is M over P, money supply over price, at the equilibrium. Basically, it's the same thing as we see in the liquidity preference model, where we see the horizontal, the vertical money supply curve dictated by the Fed's policies, and meeting with the nominal money demand curve, and then horizontally we see the price level at equilibrium. But the real quantity of money demand supplied is money supply over price, M over P, at equilibrium. And so how does it play into government revenue? Well, there's a thing called Seigniorage. And Seigniorage basically is the profit made on printing money. So I mean, obviously, we probably all thought of it once before. Why doesn't the government just print more money to pay off, say, its debt, or just to buy anything? And technically it can. And it does do that. A lot of governments do that, but you can't let it go out of control, or else you might actually be losing money in a way. And so how that works basically is something called real Seigniorage. Real Seigniorage is basically the real profit you make adjusted for inflation. Basically, we look at the real quantity of money demand. We could look at real Seigniorage as change over money supply over price, delta M over P. And this can be manipulated into this same equation, which is delta M over M, change of money supply over the current money supply, times the real quantity of money demand supply, which is money supply over P. And so basically, as we print more money, obviously inflation picks up, the price level picks up, and so this part of the equation decreases. So this part of the equation has to increase to keep up real Seigniorage. So our change of money supply has to increase in proportion to our current money supply, because we have to print money above the inflation rate almost to keep up real government profit.
Let's see. So in the next slide, we're going to see the vicious how this vicious cycle generates. But I think it's very creative to get a real variable like delta M over P, real Seigniorage, becomes product of the two variables. Okay, the relative increase of the money supply and the real money demand. Okay,
so when we look at hyperinflation and inflation tax, basically we look at obviously during times of hyperinflation, the price level rapidly increases, way above the money supply, and so our real money demand from this expression decreases obviously. So to real Seigniorage equals change of money supply over money supply times our real money demand. So as real money demand decreases, our change of money supply over money supply must increase rapidly.
That really means you have to print more money. To keep up the real Seigniorage, because what really important to the government is a real variable. It's a real variable.
And to put it in simple terms, basically you have to print money at a faster rate to keep up with inflation, so that your real government profit from Seigniorage at least stays the same. And so this is a vicious cycle, because as our delta M increases, you print even more money at a faster rate. Your real money demand decreases because your price level is increasing even more now. And so basically, this happens because as our expected inflation rate, pi represents inflation rate. So our expected inflation rate increases because you're printing money at a faster rate. Then your price level continues to increase, and your real money demand continues to decrease at a faster rate. So you just keep printing money at a faster and faster rate. Hopefully, at some point, you're probably going to be unable to outpace the decrease in real money demand. And so this happens when our real money demand basically reaches virtually zero.
That really means the pricing level is too high. Okay, so it makes no sense for the government to print any more money, because the pricing level is prohibitively high. So eventually, that means the government lose the independence of the money authority.
Because here basically your profit, when your currency is void, when your real money demand is zero, basically your Seigniorage is done. Your profit is over. And this basically happened in Venezuela recently. Venezuela at one point was printing out $1 trillion bills. Their currency was literally useless. And now their currency is in U.S. dollars, South African rand, and
that's
gold.
Zimbabwe. Yeah, Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe.
Yeah, Zimbabwe. But today's Venezuela is very similar.
Yeah,
it's pretty much the same story.
But
so,
Venezuela, their official currency is still not the U.S. dollar, but they a lot of their transactions are in the black market are in U.S. dollars.
Yeah.
And so the inflation tax is basically what we see from Seigniorage. Inflation tax is basically the theoretical revenue that the government makes from Seigniorage.
Yeah.
And so the inflation tax basically just we calculate like a regular tax, and so it equals our inflation rate times our real money demand. And our next graph will see how we can maximize our inflation tax for the
because that's an inflation. That's a real money transaction, right? The real money transaction, that's a tax base. That's tax base, and that's a tax rate. So basically, that's the government want to collect as much inflation tax as possible.
Yes. So it has to balance the size of its tax rate with its tax base.
Yeah. Let's see.
Very similar with the Laffer curve that we brought up earlier, except this time it's more extreme. And so we see here, we have hyperinflation. Let's look at an example of hyperinflation first. So we see this is our real money demand peak versus its initial.
Yeah, that means initial is 1. Then when they printed too much money, the real money demand decreased so fast, could be virtually 0.
Yes.
Let's look at Hungary.
And then this is our peak monthly inflation rate. At some point it reached 10 to the 16th power, which is more than billions. And so we see here Hungary after World War II was in this graph the worst case of hyperinflation because its real money demand reached almost 0 and its peak monthly inflation rate was very high, to say the least. And we see a lot here happens after World War I, especially with Germany. Germany after World War I had many debt reparations, and which caused great hyperinflation to pay those war reparations, and this probably led to the collapse of the Weimar Republic and its rise of the Nazi Party, but that's another story. And we see here Zimbabwe, their real money demand is almost 0, basically 0. So they're basically right on the x-axis. If they were
actually already outlined here.
Their peak monthly inflation rate was around 10 to 23rd power, and so they basically would be right on the x-axis, far off the graph.
It's even out like here. So it's amazing how addictive. When you put in more money to finance your debt, it could be how addictive that could be, and it's amazing because it's peak monthly inflation rate. It's not annual; it's monthly. So it's really amazing.
So we talked about the inflation rate and a tax-based tax rate, and so basically this is how it works. So we see here inflation tax equals tax rate times tax base. We need to look at the optimal inflation rate to maximize the area of the inflation tax. And so we see here the optimal
it's a similar question. It's optimal data. How much money you should print out? More money. How much more you should print out to max your salary, which is very close to the inflation tax anyway. So delta MPM equals delta M. So it's a very similar graph, but a different X and Y.
If we plot our inflation rate versus our real money demand, we see here obviously as inflation increases, real money demand decreases. And we need to find a certain inflation rate that corresponds with a certain real money demand that maximize the area here of the inflation tax.
It's actually the inflation tax rate versus inflation tax base. Right? The transaction total amount.
So for our final clue, basically real Seigniorage is dependent on our real money demand supply, because as real money demand supply decreases as we print more money, as the inflation rate, expected inflation rate increases, mainly expected inflation rate, because if we expect more inflation, our price level is already going to increase far more already in the current, in the present. And so real money demand supply decreases causes us to print more money at a faster rate. And so hyperinflation basically will avoid this currency, because eventually our real money demand supply will theoretically reach 0, and in real life virtually 0. And so at that point our currency will be useless, and the government tax Seigniorage real profit for government is over.
Basically the government lost their currency. Just like today's Zimbabwe.
And just like how
today's Venezuela. I think the fate is the same, because the price level is so high, which means your currency is basically goes to like nothing. Okay. So today we'll just discuss the real Seigniorage, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.